The year 1942 ended with more bad news for Japan. On December 31, the new U.S. aircraft carrier Essex, first of many to be built by the Americans during the war, was commissioned. Carriers would prove to be the deadly enemies of our submarines in the war's final year. A total of 1592 Allied and neutral merchant ships went to the bottom of the ocean in 1942. Nearly three-fourths of these were sunk in the Atlantic and Mediterranean Oceans. Of those sent down in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, our submarines accounted for only a small portion. Our 19 submarine losses since Pearl Harbor were not compensated for by great accomplishments. And 1943 did not promise to be a banner year, chiefly because so much of our submarine force was tied to supply operations. Around the end of 1942, because of the war's changing pattern, Japan's top strategists realized that the decisive battle concept of warfare was giving way to an island-by-island struggle. This gave birth to the I-351 class of submarines, and later to the I-361 class. Both were designed strictly for transport operations. I-351 was designed to carry materials necessary for use at midget submarine bases, which the Naval General Staff planned to scatter throughout our network of island defences, so this type submarine could also serve as a secret submarine base herself. A lot of discussion was held concerning the I-351 class, of which 3 were planned. Only 2 were laid down, but they were finished as seaplane-tending submarines to do the kind of work I-26 and I-124 had done in the Guadalcanal fight. Each boat was 364 feet long and displaced 3,531 tons. They could make 15.8 knots on the surface and 6.3 knots submerged. Ranjay was 13,000 milers at 14 knots, and they had a special capacity of 365 tons of gasolina over and above the submarine's fuel load. This was to be carried in special tanks set outside the inner hull, amidships. I-351 could carry 15 aircraft torpedoes plus 30 of our 550 lb. Bombs, or she could carry 60 of the bombs if no aircraft torpedoes were loaded aboard. She could also carry an extra 1.5 tons of provisions and 11 tons of fresh water as cargo, and cruise for periods up to 60 days. Her crew would be 77 men, plus 13 passengers as relief crews for the flying boats tended. By use of special fittings, I-351 and I-352 could each refuel 3 seaplanes at the same time. Armament of the I-351 class was 4 bow tubes. She could load these before sailing and carry 4 spare torpedoes if her other ammunition cargo was reduced. When finally completed, I-351 had no large deck guns, but mounted 7 machine guns. These were 2 twin 20mm on the conning tower and a triple 20mm on deck forward. This pair of submarines were called Sen-Ho, replenishment submarine type. The decision to make plans for these specially designed transport submarines came just after the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942. Rear Adm. Raizo Tanaka, with 8 destroyers, met an American force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers while making a supply run to Guadalcanal. Although the Americans surprised him by picking him up on radar and opening fire before he was aware of their presence, Tanaka fought a great fight. Ieyan Takanami went down, but so did the U.S. heavy cruiser Northampton. Tanaka's intrepid destroyer men then used American gun flashes as points of aim and blew the bows off the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans. This second vessel may have been the world's only warship to collide with herself. Her bow, separated from the ship, came about and crashed into the chief petty officer's quarters at the ship's stern. Tanaka's men also wounded another heavy cruiser, USS Pensacola. This trio of warships saw no further combat for more than a year. A 5th cruiser, USS Honolulu, escaped harm only because she turned behind the other American ships and was screened. Tanaka retreated because he didn't have enough torpedoes on board his ships to make a second engagement feasible. Superiors leaped at this seeming reluctance to wage battle as an excuse to relieve this quick-to-laugh critic who had put his finger on the situation's centre point right after arriving in the Solomons. he had almost immediately suggested Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal rather than its reinforcement. He advocated withdrawing up the slot, then digging in and preparing bases for a counterattack, using air cover from airfields that would be closer to the point of combat than Rabaul. When this suggestion was shunted aside, Tanaka recommended massive, as opposed to piecemeal, reinforcement of the island. His second piece of advice was taken too late, and his first was taken only after he was relieved and transferred to the rear area. Historians all state that the first 6 months of 1943 were a combat lull. I and other Japanese submariners can tell them quite differently. On Jan. 14. I took RO-10I out through Tokyo Bay on her way to Rabaul. I arrived at Rabaul on Jan 27, hoping to accomplish great things. I made none of the Guadalcanal runs, as it turned out, being assigned to patrol missions instead. But 16 other submarines were assigned to that type of work. Torpedoes were loaded into their tubes, but all spare parts were put ashore, together with most of the topside armaments. Rations for each submarine's crew were reduced to the minimum, so boats would have more room for rations for the 20,000 starving soldiers. One large-size submarine could carry enough food to last the Guadalcanal garrison for 2 days, and rear adm. Mito made a run himself in I-8 to see how the operation worked. By February of 1943, a total of 28 successful runs, delivering about 1,500 tons of supplies and ammunition, were made. Our submarines were attacked on 7 different occasions and 2 were sunk. One, I-3, I have already told about. The other was I-1, led to Sidar. Aichi Sakamoto took I-1 out of Rabaul on Jan 24 and put into Buin to pick up supplies. Then he moved down to Guadalcanal, arriving off Kamimpo Point on Jan 29, having travelled most of the way submerged. This grandfather of our modern submarines was nearly 16 years old when she surfaced that night about 9 p.m. and prepared to offload cargo. Unknown to Sakamoto, his boat had already been picked up on radar by the Australian corvette HMAS Kiwi. I-1's aftergun had been removed to make room for a landing craft to move cargo to shore. So, on finding herself under fire, she could only man her forward deck gun. Its crew was wiped out instantly. Sakamoto himself was mortally wounded by fire from this small but deadly enemy, which kept pouring out shells from her deck and machine guns. Even rifle fire was exchanged during the battle, and during one of the 3 times I-1 was rammed by HMAS Kiwi, her navigator tried to board the Australian ship and fight it out hand-to-hand with his sword. A sister ship of Kiwi, the HMAS Moa, joined the battle after a while, and also rammed I-1. With 30 men dead, the executive officer, Lieutenant Sadayoshi Korida, tried to beach the submarine. He ran his submarine up on the beach and with the remnants of his crew, 50 men, joined our forces in Guadalcanal's jungle. The US Navy claimed that it captured many secret documents from the beached I-1, but this is open to question, because Lieutenant Korida told me he burned them on shore. My first patrol in RO-101 was made on orders from Rear ADM, Kaku Harada. Harada sent 3 submarines out to stations east of Port Moresby, with orders to stop any enemy attempt to interfere with the planned withdrawal from Guadalcanal. RO-100 and RO-103 went out when I did. I-18, already in the Coral Sea for this purpose, was lost carrying out her mission. In the first week of February, Japanese destroyers made 60 runs to Guadalcanal, bringing off an evacuation which for daring and success compares favourably with the English at Dunkirk and the American at Hungnam, Korea. It had one more thing in common with the American evacuation during the Korean War too, because when American Marines in 1950 said, "Retreat, hell, we're advancing in another direction," they were copying a phrase from their former enemies, the Japanese, who had coined it 7 years earlier. Altogether, 1330 of our men were taken off Guadalcanal, 832 of them Navy men, without a bit of opposition, in what our High Command called a tenshin, turned advance. American records list our RO-102 as being sunk on February 11, 1943. They are wrong. It was I-18 under Sea Doctor Tomichi Muraoka, lost in the Coral Sea on that date, the 2604th anniversary of our Emperor Jimmu's accession to the throne of Japan. Our belief is that Japan became a nation when that happened, and our calendar is based on it. I, like thousands of other men in 1939, had chosen February 11. For my wedding day, feeling that no other day could possibly be more auspicious for a marriage than Japan's 2600th anniversary. Sea Doctor Muraoka's boat, I-18, was the victim of a combined air-sea attack. She was sighted by a scout plane from the American light cruiser Helena. It dropped a bomb, then a smoke pot to mark the sub's location for destroyer Fletcher, which hurried to the scene, picked up I-18 on her sonar equipment, and laid down a barrage of depth charges. A short time later, the men in Fletcher's gun houses heard an explosion so great that they thought their ship had either blown out its own bottom with shallow-set charges or had been hit by a torpedo. Actually, it was the death of I-18. RO-100 was almost sunk. She was 30 miles south of Port Moresby on February 14, when Lieutenant Kanemi Sakamoto sighted an enemy transport. He began manoeuvring to attack, and became so engrossed in trying to make a kill that he neglected to observe the submariner's routine precaution, frequent sweeps of the entire seascape with his periscope. As a result, an American destroyer escort was able to approach him almost unnoticed. Sakamoto saw this onrushing ship at the last moment and dived. The DE dropped over a dozen depth charges. They smashed RO-100's periscope and caused other damage. Sakamoto, unable to continue on patrol, had to make for Rabaul. I was almost trapped too. I got word on February 16 of what happened to RO-100 and arbitrarily maintained radio silence for 4 days to avoid detection. On February 22, my navigator, Letter Shigeshi Kondo, sighted a single-stack ship of about 4,000 tons displacement. She was obviously an old ship and appeared to be an easy victim. Still, something about her bothered me when I took over the periscope from Kondo. Her plimsoll line was well above the ocean's surface, and I could clearly make out the difference between her above-water and below-water paints. "That ship is very nearly empty," I told Kondo. "And if she is empty, it is because she is returning from a supply trip to Port Moresby. In that case, she would be heading east. But she is heading west. I don't like it. Let us wait a while before attacking." So we waited. The enemy ship continued on her eastward course for some time, then turned to the north. I waited some more. After a while, she changed course again, to the west. "Aha!" I cried out. "A Q ship!" During World War I, the British, whom the Japanese helped in escorting ships through the Mediterranean, in exchange for which Britain backed her demand for a mandate to the German islands north of the equator, had disguised and equipped old merchants' ships with masked gun batteries and depth-charge racks. These vessels proved to be deadly lures for the German U-boats, many of whose captains paid with their lives for taking the bait. I decided that I would not join those dead German submarine captains. I kept RO-101 submerged, instead of surfacing to close in rapidly, and used my periscope sparingly. We had sighted the enemy ship about 3 p.m. I decided I would stay down until well after dark, surface very late at night to recharge batteries, then submerge to prepare for a dawn attack. My plan didn't work. At sunset, the enemy vessel suddenly picked up speed and ran away in the direction of Port Moresby. I searched for it the next 2 days without success and returned to Rabaul on February 28. RO-103 came in 2 days later. Her skipper, Lieutenant Hidenori Fujita, had had no luck either. When our submarines began their transport work to Guadalcanal, General MacArthur's offensive in New Guinea intensified. It became very difficult for Japanese surface ships to get in past MacArthur's air umbrella, so submarines were ordered to lend a hand there. Before I came on the scene, 9 submarines had made a total of 20 trips from Rabaul to New Guinea. After my RO-101 joined the operation, 75 more trips were made, through September of 1943. Total supplies put ashore on New Guinea by submarines from December 1942 to September 1943 was about 3,500 tons. These operations, strangely enough, cost us only one submarine, I-4, although I-176 did suffer heavy damage during an attack. In replenishing New Guinea, Japanese submarines employed 2 ingenious devices. They were called unkato, stores carrier tube, and unpoto, cannon carrier. The unpoto was introduced first. It consisted of 2 hollow cylinders placed side by side with a platform built over the top of them. Overall length of this device was 71 feet, overall width 13 feet. On top of the platform, an artillery piece was lashed into place and tied down securely, along with cases of shells for the gun. Slung under the platform were the afterparts, the power plants, and fuel flasks of 2 torpedoes. An unpoto weighed 20 tons and displaced 37 tons after cargo was loaded. One of our submarines would strap a loaded unpoto to its afterdeck at Rabaul after loading its other cargo, then head for a New Guinea rendezvous. There, the submarine would rise to just below the surface, its deck just a bit awash. Crewmen would climb out, unlash the unpoto, then return to the submarine's hull, leaving only the cannon carrier's operator above the water. The submarine would then lower itself only enough to let the unpoto float free, after which the operator would start the torpedo's power plants, which could drive the mechanized raft about 2 miles at 6 knots. The operator would run it right up on the shore at a selected spot, then let down a special ramp at the unpoto's bow. Soldiers would hasten on board, carry away the ammunition, and roll the artillery piece into the jungle. The unpoto was already working successfully when the unkato was introduced. This was truly a remarkable experiment. The unkato was a cylinder 136 feet long with cone-shaped ends. It was 16 feet in diameter. Both of the cones were ballast tanks, and there was a third ballast tank in the unkato's centre. These 3 compartments were separate from the long cargo space, which had a capacity of 377 tons of food, ammunition, and medicines. With a strong hull structure that permitted submerging to depth of 400 feet, the unkato was adjusted after loading so that it had slightly negative buoyancy. Then it would be towed out into the middle of Simpson Harbour and secured by a long tow line to the stern of a submarine. Once the submarine cleared Rabaul, it would cruise along the northern coast of New Britain to the point where its submerged run was to begin. When the submarine dived, the unkato would submerge with it. On arrival off New Guinea, the submarine would surface and release the unkato, which was then towed to the beach by men from the shore. I-21 was operating off Sydney when I arrived in Rabaul. During January and February, she was credited with a total of 6 ships. I-10 was in the south, also, her plane making reconnaissances over Noumea, Torres Island and Auckland to report on enemy ship groupings. The Japanese army, meanwhile, had gotten into the submarine business too. It had decided it needed an underwater fleet to supply outlying posts. General Hideki Tojo was in on this plan, which he ordered kept secret from the Imperial Navy. If the Navy learns of Army plans to build submarines, he said, it will surely oppose them. So don't tell the Navy. Construct all submarines in secrecy. Later on, when the Navy learned of this work, it cooperated in the building of them, lent technicians and provided advice. However, we had nothing to do with the actual operation. These special submarines were called Maru-U, circle transport. The first word meant nothing. It was merely a security device. About 50 were built, but only 3 got into service, making supply and transport runs to the Philippines in late 1944. The rest were still undergoing shakedown and operational training when the war ended. Because so many records were burned, In 1945, I have been able to learn nothing about these submarines except that they displaced 270 tons, had no torpedo tubes or torpedoes, carried a single 30mm machine gun on deck for armament, and were an awful waste. Our Navy's submarine fleet could have used the skills and materials that went into building these useless craft, especially when the year 1944 saw most of our submarine fleet wiped out. It was early in 1943, also, that Germany made a special proposal to Japan. U-boats were then sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced, and Hitler offered to give Japan, at no charge, 2 of his newest and best submarines. We were to study these, then turn out copies in large numbers for a massive assault on enemy supply lines on our side of the world. Agreement was reached, and U-511 left Lorient, France, in May 1943 with a German crew. She refueled from I-10 in the Indian Ocean en route and made port finally at Cure during August. That German submarine was studied very carefully, then given to the submarine school for use as a trainer, being renumbered RO500. I will tell of the submarines that were developed from it later. My next 2 sorties from Rabaul were special ones, not regular patrols. I got orders for the first one in the officers' quarters at Rabaul, halfway up the hill from Simpson Harbour. With me were the captains of RO100 and RO103, Alts Sakamoto and Fujita. I was a lieutenant commander, having been promoted on my graduation from Submarine Commanders School. The date was March 3rd. Today is Hina Matsuri, Sakamoto was saying. He was referring to Japan's annual doll festival, its Girls' Day, celebrated by everyone, although it is supposed to be a special day just for females. Let's have a sake party tonight. Fujita and I had just agreed that this was a fine idea when a sedan from submarine headquarters raced up and screeched to a halt. Its driver jumped out and came to attention. "Captains Orita and Fujita are wanted at headquarters right away," he blurted out. We got into the car and headed for the dock where the flagship, IJN Jingei, was moored. There, Dr. Miyoshi Horinuchi, Chief Staff Officer to Rear ADM, Haradi, explained things while the Admiral looked on. The convoy that left here for Leh 2 days ago has been under heavy enemy air attack since yesterday. We have suffered very great losses in the Bismarck Sea area. Many soldiers and sailors have been cast into the sea, and no surface ships can get near enough to rescue them. Horinuchi was referring to 8 transports and 8 destroyers that had put out from Rabaul to make a mass reinforcement of New Guinea. The novel technique of skip bombing was employed against our ships in this action, and it worked excellently. Instead of dropping their bombs from high altitude, enemy bombers approached very low and half-dropped, half-flung their bombs at the sides of our ships, almost as though they were launching torpedoes. Even when a bomb missed, it exploded upon impact with the water and had the effect of a mine going off nearby. As a result, all 8 transports, plus 4 of the destroyers, were sunk. "The enemy's watch is very close," said Horinuchi, "so we plan to use submarines to make rescues. Orita, you will get RO-101 ready for sea at once. Fujita, you will get RO-103 ready and stand by to go out later." I had my boat running out of Rabaul by dawn of the next day. Being watchful for enemy aircraft made our progress cautious and slow, so we did not arrive in the disaster area until the evening of March 6th. The best chart of the area we had on board RO-101 was more than 50 years old. We had constantly to remain alert for uncharted reefs. It was dawn of March 7th when one of my lookouts finally sighted the first lifeboat. We approached and found some survivors in it. They waved feebly and tried to thank us, but did not have the strength. We later located 2 more boatloads. All were severely sunburned, and none had eaten for 4 days. When they managed to croak out a word, it was "Omisu." Water! It was insanity. I could not take time out to search for a flag, even though I knew how much it meant to them. In the Japanese army, it was a tradition that any unit losing its regimental standard died with that loss. The unit's name was stricken from army records. It was bad fortune, and survivors naturally lost face and felt accursed. Though it pained me, I had to ignore their pleas. I ordered RO 101 to submerge and stay below until after sunset. The 47 men we had picked up really cramped us. I wirelessed Rabaul that I had a full load and was returning. RO 103 left Rabaul then to continue the search. Fujita's submarine got into trouble on the evening on March 9th, running up on an uncharted reef. RO 103 wirelessed Rabaul for help, and I was ordered out to tow her free. Fujita was able to free RO 103 before I arrived by jettisoning all the food that could be spared and casting his torpedoes over the side. An American destroyer was sighted to the south on the afternoon of March 10th, prompting Fujita to throw all classified documents into the sea lest they be captured. When the enemy ship steamed away, apparently without having spotted him, Fujita dumped more excess weight and was able to float free by morning of March 11th. I heard the full and horrible story of the Bismarck Sea later, after a boatload of 13 men, carrying with them the standard of the 115th Regiment, was cast up on New Britain. Private First Class Shotaro Tamura, official flag-bearer for Kole Tarashi Endo's regiment, told its story. On March 2nd, he said, we were met in the sea of Dampier Strait by enemy bombers. They were waiting for us. The attack that day was not very severe. I saw flames rise from only one transport before it sank. Enemy reconnaissance planes kept following us after that. They dropped flares throughout the night, exposing every ship as if in daylight. No one got any sleep. At about 8 a.m. on March 3rd, we saw countless bombers coming at us from the direction of New Guinea. They were so thick that they looked like a flat black cloud, spreading wide on both sides. The wings of the planes seemed almost to touch one another. Tamura and his comrades aided the ship's gunners by opening up at the enemy planes with rifles, machine guns, and even pistols. It did no good. The first wave of planes on that second day did mortal damage. A second wave came in about 2 hours later, said Tamura. I could see many Curtiss, Bell, and Lockheed fighters in it. The convoy was just about destroyed by then, so these planes concentrated on the survivors. They came in to strafe again and again, their guns like a great rake collecting leaves. We leaped from the lifeboats each time they approached, clambering back on board after we thought they had gone. Fighter groups kept coming at us every 30 minutes or so. Colonel Endo was killed in a lifeboat, the victim of 7 fighter planes. He was standing, telling us what to do, when bullets tore into him. 8 more of my comrades were killed that way, while still in lifeboats. Lieutenant Kondo, of my company, was also killed in this manner. About 7 a.m. the next morning, March 4th, we were strafed again. No one was killed, but several men were wounded. About 1 p.m. we sighted Japanese planes overhead and cheered. They didn't stay long, though, and at 2 p.m. more enemy planes appeared and strafed us. That time we saw them early and suffered no casualties because we all leaped into the water in time. There were 39 other men in the lifeboat with Tamura. Each one had a day's rice ration with him. There were also 16 katsuoboshi, a sort of salami-shaped stick of dried bonito fish. With rice, it could sustain a man pretty well for a short period. The men also found 20 sacks of hard biscuits in the boat, plus 2 small kegs of water. This, together with what each man carried in his water canteen, was the total of their food and water supply for 31 days. Of the 40 men in that lifeboat who were alive on March 4th, only 13 staggered ashore on a beach near the western end of New Britain in April. Of nearly 7,000 men, more than 3,000 had been killed. Most of these were slaughtered by low-flying enemy planes after they had safely abandoned ship, or by American PT boats that came out of New Guinea bases to mop up, as American historian Morrison puts it in his official history of the U.S. Navy in World War II. In 1948, I was called and interrogated by occupation authorities in the Ichioka case, which involved some Japanese submariners who had maltreated or machine-gunned ship survivors in the Indian Ocean. These men were tried and convicted of violating the rules of war. Since I had never operated in the Indian Ocean, and since nothing of that kind occurred in the Pacific, I was released after about 6 hours of questioning. On that occasion, and sometimes since, I have thought of the comparison between events in the Indian Ocean and what took place in the Bismarck sea slaughter. I suppose war atrocities are committed only by the losing side. We suffered no submarine losses at all during the month of March 1943, although we very nearly lost I-176, the boat of Litakeda Tanabe, the hero of Midway. He had made the first and other successful supply run to Guadalcanal and was making one to New Guinea when death reached out for him again. I have the story from Asakichi Araki, who later commanded Japan's first post-war division of submarines in our maritime self-defense force. In 1943, he was a lieutenant and the executive officer of I-176, which was standing about 400 yards off Leh on March 19th. She had a cargo of food and ammunition and was taking advantage of evening twilight to unload them. The sea off Leh was still as a mirror, says Araki, and I could see the reflection of the setting sun in the western sky. The dark mountains of New Guinea were silhouetted against it. We were surfaced and waiting for some Daihatsu that had just put out from shore to come alongside. Captain Tanabe and I were on the bridge of the conning tower. On the main deck, our crewmen were wearing white hachimaki, bandanas of determination, about their foreheads. 2 of the landing craft moored on each side of us, and our men began carrying bags of supplies from the hatches to these 4 craft. I-176 crewmen were experienced in this effort now, and their precise labour-saving moves reminded me of the works of a clock. Each grain of rice meant added life to the soldiers and navy men at Leh. They were half-starved, and the Daihatsu working parties gave a ragged cheer as their landing craft came close to us. For their part, our sailors were moved deeply by the sight of these brave men. They added small gifts to the cargo, each one welcomed by the Leh garrison, even if it were only a torn and creased newspaper. It became quite dark as the loading proceeded. The job was about half done when, suddenly, I saw red rockets rise above the beach and burst. This was the danger signal. "Emergency dive!" shouted Captain Tanabe, but it was too late. 3 medium bombers swooped over a nearby hill, machine guns twinkling in their noses. They came in low and dropped a cluster of bombs. I dropped through the hatch into the conning tower, just as I-176 took a great lurch to port, slamming me against a bulkhead. When the submarine remained in a listing position, I automatically shouted, "Blow the port main tank." I was sure our boat had been holed and wanted to lighten her so she would roll back to an even keel. If she didn't, she might capsize. Reports of many leaks in the submarine began coming to the conning tower. I ordered them repaired. The next moment I looked up and saw Captain Tanabe trying to make his way down the ladder from the open bridge. "I'm shot," he said feebly. "Take command, Araki." Our signals petty officer helped me get Captain Tanabe through the hatch, then closed it. As he did so, I could hear water sloshing about the open bridge. I-176 was already diving. A few moments more, and Tanabe would have been left up there to drown. Later on I learned from men on shore that they'd seen a high pillar of fire rise from our stern where a bomb had struck. I-176 had listed to one side and disappeared almost at once, making them think we had been sunk. Days after that, we learned from foreign news reports that enemy aircraft claimed to have sunk a destroyer at Leh that night. It was a good thing those planes thought they sank us in that first pass. Had they made another, they would have been sure to do the job. We found that Captain Tanabe had a bullet lodged near his heart. I had command. What to do now? Surface. The enemy might be waiting. Remain submerged? Impossible. I could hear air hissing from leaks all over the boat. We were taking on too much water. We would keep going right to the bottom unless something were done. Captain Tanabe was gotten to his berth, where I told him I intended to beach the submarine and try to make repairs. He could only nod, he was so weak. He knew the tide rise was enough, so that if I put I-176 on the shore now, she could be floated off when the tide was full. I left his side and returned to the conning tower, where the water reached to my knees. I ordered the periscope raised to its maximum height and peered through it. Scanning the shoreline, I made out the mouth of a river. That was where I could beach our boat. I called out, "Right full rudder, all engines ahead full." We had our main air pumps working, expelling air from the ballast tanks, and our depth gauge showed 60 feet. I received reports from time to time that the water leaks were being stopped. That was good news. Slow to standard speed. I ordered. Then, stop engines. I-176 still had some way on and was coasting toward the shore. Just as I felt her hull scrape, I ordered all engines backed full a few seconds, then stopped them. Everything fell silent. A look at the depth gauge showed me that I-176 should be at least partly above water now, so I ordered the conning tower hatch cracked. To my relief, no water came in, so I climbed up to the open bridge. I looked around. All of the hull, except for the extreme forward section and part of the conning tower, was still under water and the bow was elevated at a slight angle. I ordered more water blown out of the main tanks. Soon most of the main deck was above water. Then I ordered crew members out on deck to find the rest of the leaks and plug them. Some checked the upper hull, while others got into the water and felt along the sides of the submarine with their bare hands. I had to order the deck grating torn up to get at holes. The chief engineering officer didn't think I-176 could make it back to Rabaul. He didn't like the list we still had on, and neither did I. Inside a submarine, a sharp list has a deep psychological effect on crewmen, making them fearful of a capsizing. I masked my feelings and told the chief engineering officer in a voice loud enough to carry well that we would repair I-176 or die trying. I think my words gave me more courage than they gave to others, but the crew worked hard as I moved among them, urging them to hurry and get the job done before midnight. We had to get off during that tide, or sit in the open, an easy target, all the next morning. Things seemed to be going well after a while, so I went below to see the captain. "If repairs can be finished in time, sir," I said, "I will haul off, make a test dive and start back to Rabaul." In a soft voice, he said that he didn't like that idea. "It might be better," he said, "to lie here on the bottom in shallow water for a while and make sure that all is well." I appreciated his advice, wondering why I had not thought of that myself. Perhaps my mind had been preoccupied with getting I-176 out of the danger area. Patience, I realized, would serve me better in the long run. Repair work was still going on when the 4 Daihatsu that had been searching for possible survivors came upon us. They were sure that I-176 had been destroyed and was somewhere on the bottom. I told them to get the food, guns and ammunition off the ship. This they did, lightening us considerably. The officer in charge of these craft wished us well as he backed off into the darkness, his boat bearing away the bodies of 2 crewmen who had been killed in the bombing strafing attack, plus the wounded signals petty officer Nomura. I had suggested to the captain that it might be well if he went ashore too, so he could get medical treatment at Leh. He declined, preferring to remain with his ship. The tide was high by then, and our air flasks were full, our batteries fully charged, so I tried backing I-176 off the shore. She wouldn't move. The hull had settled. Suction kept us fast to the shore. At that point I ordered all hands who were not needed at cruising stations to assemble on deck. As I ordered the engines backed, they ran from one side of I-176 to the other, shifting their weight. They laughed and shouted like children playing a game. After a while, I-176 rolled a bit with them, then a bit more. All of a sudden, she shook herself free of the Earth's grip and floated. We were free. Crewmen ran to the base of the conning tower and grinning and shouting congratulations to me. I returned their grins, then ordered all hands below except the bridge watch. We moved out a short distance, submerged, and rested on the bottom at 135 feet. I let all crew members who were not needed to check leaks get some sleep, and, after I made several turns through the boat to check the watertight integrity myself, turned into my bunk. When I awoke, it was nearly sunset. All holes in the submarine had been plugged with dowels and rags, thanks to the ingenuity and skills of Captain Tanabe's hand-picked crew. Some holes were 5 inches in diameter, but I felt sure they would withstand pressure. Slowly we came to the surface. All was well. The repairs held. I swung I-176 about, and we steamed smoothly out of Leh Harbour at a respectable 18 knots. I-176 got back to Rabaul on March 22nd. Tanabe received preliminary medical care there and was sent home to recuperate. There he was honoured by a personal audience with the Emperor. The rest of us submarine captains prepared to take part in another mass attempt to smash the enemy power in the Solomons Bismarck's theatre. My portion would include my first war patrol in the Solomons. Chapter 11. The Solomons, Bismarcks and the Aleutians. 2 days after Tanabe's I-176 got back to Rabaul, I left there for a station southeast of Guadalcanal. Our O-101's mission was to make weather reports, provide air-sea rescue, and to attack enemy shipping. Our departure was made 7 days before X-Day, April 1st, the date Adem. Yamamoto had set for an all-out air attack on enemy holdings in the Solomons. For this he had put about 175 of his carrier planes on Rabaul, to supplement about 200 already there. Most of the planes staged right through Rabaul, moving on to other airfields we had by then established closer to Henderson Field. Reinforcements began moving out of Rabaul by sea on April the 6th, protected by a great overhead blanket of Zero fighters. Air fights continued in the Solomons for the next 6 days, climaxed by a heavy air assault on Guadalcanal. Then Adem. Yamamoto turned on New Guinea, sending all available planes against Buna, Port Moresby and Milner Bay. On Upperus 16, satisfied with the results reported by our flyers, ADM, Yamamoto ended this operation. He believed that nearly 30 enemy ships had been sunk and 180 enemy aircraft destroyed. Outside of making weather reports twice daily, RO-101 did nothing on this patrol, having sighted no enemy vessels we could attack. On Aprema 5, I received a wireless order from Rabaul to head for waters off Cap Espérance, where some of our bomber crewmen were down and adrift. As we approached the position given, we found it thick with FT boats. American PT boats turned out to be the unconquerable enemy of Japanese submarines. They were very small, which made them hard to see, either at sea or against a shoreline. It did no good to fire torpedoes at them, as the Model 95s passed well beneath them. And they had radar. While they could hide under the smallest cover cast by an overshadowing cloud or in a cove, they could still see us at a great distance with their electronic eyes. They could dart in and attack with machine guns, torpedoes, or depth charges, then race away at high speed before a submarine could do anything. When a Japanese submarine spotted one of these torpedo boats, the only thing it could do was dive and run away. That's what I had to do. I got back to Rabaul on April 11. 2 days after I left Rabaul on patrol, there was an old-fashioned sea battle in the Aleutians area. One of our escorted convoys, trying to reinforce Attu, had to turn back while its protecting escorts engaged an enemy interception force. It was cruisers and destroyers fighting against their counterparts, in a fog, without help from submarines or aircraft on either side. Our ships managed to damage an American cruiser and a destroyer. The battle broke off when both sides began to run short of ammunition. Japanese submarines operating in the Pacific enjoyed moderate success from April through June. I-17, I-19 and I-25 were in the Fijis-Samoa area, while I-26, I-174, I-177, I-178 and I-180 were off the Australian coast. These 8 submarines claimed a total of 9 sinkings during this period. I have been able to verify only 5: SS Phoebe A. Hurst, SS William K. Vanderbilt, SS Lydia M. Child, SS Chief Ouray, and SS Robert T. Lincoln. All were in the 7,000-ton range. RO-34, under Litte Rikichi Tomita, left Rabaul the day after Yamamoto's operation began, with orders to take station down the slot, providing weather information and scouting intelligence. She was the first Japanese submarine, so far as I know, to fall victim to radar. Litte Tomita had his submarine on the surface in the evening of April 6, recharging batteries, when the USS Strong picked her up on its search set. Another destroyer, USS O'Bannon, used its radar-directed gun mounts to open up an attack with gunfire, then finished off RO-34 with depth charges. Thus perished the 21st of our submarines to be lost in the war. We lost our combined fleet commander-in-chief in April 2, after securing his massive air operation, Adam. Yamamoto decided to make an inspection swing through the islands. The Americans, through code cracking, learned of this, and set an ambush of 16 Lockheed P-38 fighter planes. Yamamoto perished in the wreckage of his shot-down aircraft. His chief of staff, Vice Adm. Matome Ugaki, survived the crash of the plane accompanying Yamamoto's. This happened on April 18th. 3 days later, Adm. Minachi Koga was named Yamamoto's successor as commander-in-chief. Late in April, our I-29, with Sea Dr. Takaichi Kinashi commanding, rendezvoused with a German submarine in the southern Indian Ocean. Kinashi picked up Mr. Chandra Bose and took him to Penang, Sumatra. Bose was the centre of anti-British feeling and strength in India. He and his associates were almost successful in their efforts to help Japan take India. The spirit that Bose rallied endured through and past the war's end was instrumental in winning India's independence. About this time, an American cruiser-destroyer force shelled our base on Attu, in the Aleutians. This was interpreted as meaning that the enemy planned to make a move in that area, so a number of submarines were pulled north to reinforce those already there. I-31, I-34 and I-35 had been making patrols in the Aleutians since the previous September. They were joined in April by I-2, I-5, I-6 and I-7, under command of Captain Tomojiro Tamaki. 9 more submarines were also ordered to that area, another excellent example of how Japan's submarine strength was diluted and diverted during the war. More than 2/3 of the submarines Japan could send to sea were engaged either in defensive or supply missions. Our contact with the oncoming enemy, except for the Indian Ocean area, was meagre. This pillar-to-post method of doing things eventually eradicated what once ranked with the world's best in submarine forces. My 5th sortie from Rabaul began on April 30th. I was to patrol off Milne Bay at the eastern end of New Guinea, along the enemy's Australia to New Guinea supply route. He had made a quick amphibious move around the island's tip and put troops ashore for a drive westward against our men on New Guinea's north coast. RO-102, under Litte Shoji Kanemoto, had been added to my submarine squadron. It followed RO-101 out on May 2nd. I reached my patrol area on May 3rd. Kanemoto had orders to take station 50 miles due south of me. On May 10th, we were ordered to exchange patrol areas. I acknowledged, but RO-102 did not. She was never heard from again. I think she was either lost operationally or fell victim to one of the many patrol aircraft flying out of New Guinea and Australia. In any case, the official US Navy chronology of World War II listed her loss incorrectly. Last word from RO-102 came on May 9th, so she could not have been sunk on February 11, as the chronology states. The Americans assaulted Attu on May 11th, with 11,000 troops and a heavy covering force that included battleships. This was the first use of America's old pre-war battleships against Japan. Until then, they had been kept well out of the combat areas since their poor compartmentation made them easy victims for our giant torpedoes. Nearly 20 destroyers screened the 3 old battle wagons. Nevertheless, 2 of our boats penetrated the escort screen and fired at USS Pennsylvania. I-31 made an attack the day after the assault on Attu began. Her torpedoes missed, after which she underwent a severe attack by a patrol bomber and 2 destroyers. She escaped due to the skill of her commanding officer. I-35 missed Pennsylvania in a torpedo attack 3 days after that, but she was also able to elude the Sea Greyhound that counter-attacked. When the Americans landed on Attu, more submarines were sent north. They were I-9, I-21, I-24, I-155, I-157, I-159, I-169, RO-104, and RO-105, all under the command of Rear Adm. Takeo Konda. He used Heian-Maru for his flagship and operated out of Paramushiro in the Kuriles chain northeast of Japan's Hokkaido. 3 submarines had to be withdrawn from this effort before long. I-2, I-155, and I-157. The first and third ran upon shoals, suffering damage to their bottoms, while I-155 had to go home for repairs after being badly buffeted in a severe storm. At a meeting on board Heian-Maru, the other captains were cautioned about operations near the Arctic. Sea Dr. Tatsuo Iri, skipper of I-34 and the senior submarine captain present, said, "While you are operating up here, don't delude yourself into thinking that fog will hide you. The enemy is equipped with a weapon he calls radar. You can never tell from which direction a shell or torpedo might come at you, in spite of the fact that a heavy fog may be surrounding your boat. Also, keep in mind that the ocean currents up here are treacherous and unpredictable. One can quite easily drift far away from his estimated position without knowing it. Use every chance you get to make a star or sun sight. Keep rechecking your position at every opportunity. Nothing can put you so much at a disadvantage up here as not knowing exactly where you are at all times." Erie, who was known to many for the deep love he held for his wife, closed the conference on a humorous note. "Don't leave your periscope up long enough for seals and otters to nibble at it," he said. "Catch a few of them instead, and bring the furs home for your akusen." On the night of May 26-27, 1943, the submarine I-7 sailed into Attu and took off 60 wounded men while also unloading food and ammunition. 2 days later, the fighting on that island ended. Over 2,300 Japanese were killed and about 30 taken prisoner. During the battle, they killed or wounded some 1,800 Americans. On May 29th, we lost another submarine thousands of miles south of Attu. She was Sea Data Hidejiro Utsuki's boat, I-178, on patrol in the South Pacific. The American sub-chaser SC-699 was the first. Sank her. Under Sea Dr. Hiroshi Hanabusa, who had figured in nearly all of our midget submarine attacks at Pearl Harbor and other places, she failed to report after June 7th. She may have hit a rock pinnacle or perished in a storm or simply suffered an accident. The Americans claimed no submarine sinking in the month of June for which we could not account, so I-24 must have been lost operationally. I-9, under Sea Dr. Akiyoshi Fuji, who'd had command of her since the war began, was sunk on June 11th. The American patrol craft PC-487 picked her up on its sound equipment and raced in, dropping 4 depth charges as I-9 dived to escape. Fuji's boat was hurt badly. It broached, rolling helplessly on the surface, and the small American ship made a high-speed run, ramming I-9. Then PC-487 backed off, opened up with gunfire, and followed with another ramming. It was a brilliantly executed kill. I-9 went down with all hands, without ever striking back at this smaller but alert enemy. Lieutenant Sea Dr. Kikuo Inouye's I-31 was less than a year old when he very nearly sank USS Pennsylvania on May 12th. Later, Inouye left Paramushiro to make an evacuation run to Kiska. He was picked up on the radar of the American destroyer Fraser on June 13th. Inouye tried to escape, but the Fraser opened up first with gunfire, then depth charges. When I-31 got beneath the surface, a second depth charge barrage came down on her, then a third. This last brought her end in a great gush of fuel oil bubbling up. 3 days after that, I-157 ran aground at Kiska. Her crewmen jettisoned everything possible, including all of her torpedoes, half of her batteries, and most of her fuel. She was able to get off and into deeper water, but lacked power to run for very long should she have to dive. She had to retreat all the way to Kure on the surface. The fourth submarine lost in attempting to assist men on Kiska was Lt. Dr. Katsuhiko Nagai's I-7. She fell victim to the American destroyer Monaghan, the same ship that sank one of our midget submarines within Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. A few hours after midnight on the morning of June 22nd, the submarine on which I had once served was picked up by Monaghan's radar at long range. The enemy ship closed in to about 1 mile, still using her radar, and opened fire with deck guns. Nagai, on the bridge of his boat, was killed in the first barrage. So was Captain Tomejiro Tamaki, commander of the submarine division to which I-7 belonged. He had been using her as his flagship. Lt. Yoshio Hanabusa, the executive officer, took over. He swung the bow about and made best speed into Vega Harbor, Kiska. He got there safely and ran up on shore, where his crew was able to make partial repairs and get the submarine off again that night. Hanabusa decided to use darkness as a cover and attempt an escape. He worked I-7 up to her top speed and raced out of Vega Harbor, only to find enemy patrol craft waiting for him. They crowded him into shoal waters and I-7 was again hung up. She had to be abandoned, although most of her crew survived. The quick-witted executive officer, furthermore, had completed an important mission. The admiral at Paramushiro had been making plans with officers of the Kiska garrison, who had been taken off the island earlier via submarine, to get the rest of the island's forces away safely. One of those staff officers had been sent back to the island on board I-7, so he could brief its defenders on when and how Vice Adm. Hosogaya would come for them. He had a list of the one-word code signals to be used. These were drafted so as to avoid heavy radio traffic, which the enemy could intercept and interpret as meaning something important was about to happen. Lt. Hanabusa had put that officer ashore on the island. On learning of I-7's loss, Vice Adm. Hosogaya, in charge of all northern naval forces, ordered that no more submarines be used in the Kiska evacuation. But, because of I-7 and her crew, nearly 5,200 other Japanese men were saved. They were saved on July 28th, when Rear Adm. Masatomi Kimura arrived off Kiska. His 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers slipped through the fog like phantoms. They loaded up the waiting 5,200 troops in less than 60 minutes and disappeared like ghosts in the grey mist. This was the second completely successful evacuation of an island, brought off by Japan in less than 6 months, the first being Guadalcanal. The enemy arrived off Kiska about 3 weeks later with 100 ships and 35,000 troops. After a ferocious bombardment of Kiska, American troops stormed ashore. They managed to shoot one another in the darkness for a while and ended up capturing some pet dogs our troops had left behind. As one American later put it, "We dropped about 100,000 surrender leaflets on the island, but those dogs couldn't read." The American military and naval phonetic alphabet in World War II used dog for vocalizing the letter D. The Americans also used D to denote the days of their various landings and invasions. Japanese sailors and soldiers, a long time later, would still be able to get laughs out of comrades by mentioning Kiska's D for Dog Day. While the northern submarines were making runs to Kiska, I was on patrol in the Solomons. I left Rabaul June 8th, the same day our battleship Mutsu was lost in the inland sea. Although her accidental sinking had nothing at all to do with submarines, I tell of it because I believe the anecdote will reveal for the first time one of the secret weapons that Japan had. Skipper of Mutsu when she sunk was Captain Teruhiko Miyoshi. With 1120 of his men, he perished when she suddenly blew up just south of Kure. Senior surviving officer was the navigator, Dr. Hideo Okihara. All he remembered was walking on deck toward the bridge, then suddenly finding himself in the sea, a good distance away, clutching a small piece of timber. The reason for this monstrous explosion in home waters was kept secret. I learned the cause of the disaster a long time later from Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu. Shimizu had command of the First Fleet when Mutsu blew up and was on board his flagship IJN Nagato, anchored not far away when it happened. The smoke from the explosion was a very bright white, he told me, the colour characteristic of our Mark III bomb. I said so at the investigation that followed. It was my opinion that Mark III explosions had caused the ship to blow up. The blast was tremendous. Our Mark III bomb was an ultra-secret weapon as closely guarded as the American atomic bomb. Each one weighed a ton and was constructed like a high-caliber battleship projectile. Each contained inside its casing ammunition equivalent to about 300 artillery shells. Mutsu's magazines were filled with Mark IIIs. A full salvo of these, fired from Mutsu's main turrets, would detonate at a height of 100,000 feet and rain down like thousands of artillery shells on an enemy ship formation. One salvo was considered enough to destroy an entire enemy task force, but the chance to prove this died with the men who died in Mutsu. Officials decided that the Mark III was too dangerous to be carried around in quantity. Mutsu still lies off Kure, all but 272 bodies recovered from her. Only 250 men survived the explosion. In mid-1943, officials at Rabaul were convinced, because of heavy enemy radio traffic and other intelligence, that the Americans were planning an assault near the centre of the Solomons chain. The enemy had already seized Russell Island, northwest of Guadalcanal, and fitted it out with a radar station to warn Henderson Field of our aircraft whenever they approached. My assignment was to patrol south of Vangunu Island, which is near Russell, and to watch for the enemy. If I saw any ships, my warning to Rabaul would bring down planes from there, Buka, Bougainville, Vila, Murida and Balale, a small island southeast of Bougainville. By July 18th I had sighted no ships at all. This worried me. Such inactivity could be the calm before a great storm. Still, RO-101 continued on our mission, although half our cruising capability had been used up. We stayed submerged by day and surfaced only after dark. About midnight of June 23rd, my navigator, Lita Jeiji Shigeshi Kondo, who had the bridge watch, heard the high sound of a Packard engine. We dived at once and listened to American PT boats pass above us, heading west. I decided they were running toward Bougainville to make a reconnaissance, so I radioed this information to Rabaul a few minutes later. For the next 7 days, we saw nothing, except that on the night darkness of July 25, we noticed fiery bullet trails on the horizon. I took this to be an exchange between some PT boats and some of our aircraft. By July 30, our food supplies were running low, so I began edging westward, trying to get the most possible patrol work out of RO-101's cruising endurance. Unknown to me, the Americans had already landed at Seggy Point, New Georgia, 9 days earlier. About 90 minutes before sunrise on June 30th, while cruising west, we again heard Packard engines, well astern of us. I dived. A short time later, my sound room picked up propeller sounds. I took a chance on using my night periscope and saw landing craft all around me. It took about 30 minutes for all of them to pass, and meantime I ordered a coded message made up. Without surfacing, I put up our radio antenna and beamed out, "Group of enemy landing craft sighted, heading west, at 5:45 a.m., adding our position at the time. It was too near daylight for us to try to make a surface run after this quarry. I kept RO-101 submerged, cruising westward at 4 knots as the propeller sounds diminished in the distance. I kept our radio antenna up for a long while, though thinking that Admiral Harada would have some orders for my boat in spite of its being near the end of its cruising endurance. Just before noon, we intercepted a wireless from the Munda garrison. "Enemy landing forces are in sight," was followed by, "Enemy troops are landing with amphibious tanks in the lead. We are exchanging fire with them." I kept heading west. At 4 p.m. an order came from Rabaul. "RO-107 will approach Munda Beach through Branch Channel," it read. RO-1001 will do the same from the area west of Rendover. Both will attack enemy forces off the beachhead. RO-100, RO-103 and RO-106 will leave Rabaul at once and head for Munda. I ordered our torpedoes checked over and readied for loading, then swung north. By dawn I was at a point about 30 miles from the concentration of enemy vessels. Almost immediately I saw 2 PT boats about 500 to 1,000 yards from us, almost as though they were escorting us to the beachhead. I ran along as silently as I could, but lost them in about an hour. Then more PT boats appeared in my scope. These did not appear to have noticed us, but stayed in one area persistently. RO-101 had to go deep, and we could not approach the Munda Beach area. At 2 p.m. on July 2nd, I tried again and got to about 20 miles from our targets. But RO-101's battery charge was now below half strength, which did not leave me enough power to conduct underwater attack operations. I decided to retreat, recharge my batteries, and try to attack the following day. The enemy appeared to have thrown rings of interceptors out to protect his landing force from submarine attack. I slipped under the PT boats and surfaced well out to sea that night for a battery charging. Then I tried to slip back in again. Early in the morning of July 2nd, my lookouts cried out, "Destroyers! Destroyers!" And again I dived. The enemy vessels proved to be PT boats, not destroyers, when I put my periscope up for a quick look around. They moved about us as though they might have picked us up on their radar sets. I used up all of that day getting away from the PT boats, but they prevented my approaching on the next day too. Then I received orders to head for Rabaul. When I arrived in Simpson Harbour, we had only 2 days' provisions left on board. RO-107 did not return at all. During the occupation, when I was interrogated by American officers, I learned that the American destroyer Radford was credited with sinking my RO-101 on July 1st. Americans' records were not correct on that score. RO-107, commanded by Later Shoichi Egi, who had survived the accidental sinking of RO-65 the previous November, was the submarine USS Radford sank. The destroyer used radar to entrap her, just as radar would trap so many more of our submarines in the night's darkness. Radford's captain made a simple, classic attack. He kept his radar on RO-107 while he moved into 1-mile range. Then he flipped open his searchlight shutters and opened fire at the same time. He repeated his salvo twice, and RO-107 was dead. I learned after the war that the American Navy leased the plush Royal Hawaiian Hotel at Waikiki Beach for its submariners, allowing them to have a full and relaxed rest between war patrols. Japanese submariners enjoyed nothing like that kind of comfort. 4 days after reaching Rabaul, we were on our way out again, with orders to intercept and attack an enemy force. It had been sighted heading for Kula Gulf, a body of water between New Georgia and Kolombangara, the next island northwest in the Solomons chain. Because of intense enemy air patrols, I was forced to keep at 3 to 4 knots speed underwater during daylight and 10 to 12 knots on the surface during some parts of the night. I got to Kula Gulf on July 11th, long after one of our destroyer reinforcement groups had sunk the U.S. cruiser Helena in a night battle. That scramble cost us a pair of destroyers in exchange for the American cruiser, but 1,200 troops got ashore on Kolombangara. Early on the morning of July 12th, I myself became one of the incorrect listings in American histories. The USS Taylor is credited with sinking I-25 on that date. She sank nothing, but she did hurt RO-101 badly. It happened just before 5 p.m., while we were on the surface to recharge batteries and replenish air supplies. My executive officer, Lit Hiromi Tokugawa, had charge of the lookouts, and I was below. We had no idea Taylor had us on her radar set and was closing in for a kill. Without any warning, a sudden barrage of shells exploded on and around the starboard side of RO-101. I ran from my cabin to the conning tower, shouting, "Full speed ahead! Emergency dive! Emergency dive!" When I stepped into the tower, 2 lookouts were dropping through the hatch, blood dripping from their wounded hands. "Probable destroyer, Captain," they called to me, adding, "The executive officer is wounded." Tokugawa kept saying, "Forget about me, sir. Dive the ship." But Seaman Yoshio Nakahara and I pulled Tokugawa's plump body through the hatch just as ROW 101 began her plunge. 3 other men had also been wounded, but we got the hatch closed before water covered the bridge. Shells were still exploding alongside us as we slipped beneath the waves. As we passed the 100-foot mark, the destroyer roared past overhead. A depth charge came down, followed by 10 more. Each time one went off, we suffered damage to some piece of equipment or another, but strangely, RO 101 kept to an even keel. Also, strangely, the enemy dropped no more depth charges after those 11. I read later that USS Taylor turned away almost at once and rejoined the convoy she was escorting. Her captain must have been satisfied that he had finished us off. I wanted to level off at 230 feet, the safe depth level of that class of submarine being 250 feet. But without the services of the wounded Tokugawa, who doubled as my diving officer, adjustments to the ballast tanks went roughly. Row 101 kept plunging downward. I watched in horror as the depth gauge needler passed 250 feet, then 300, then 350. Finally it went past the last figure on the dial, 395 feet. If the drop could not be stopped, RO 101's hull would cave in under the sea pressure. "Blow the main tank for 10 seconds, I shouted, but a long 30 seconds passed before I heard the sweet hiss of air into the ballast space pushing out water and making RO 101 lighter. Had the enemy remained on the scene of attack a few minutes longer, he would have sighted rising bubbles, indicating that we were still alive. RO 101's fall slowed gently to a stop like an elevator. Then she started upward. I hurriedly ordered the blowing stopped, lest we broach and become an easy target. The trim had to be adjusted several times, due to lack of Lee Tokugawa's services, before the boat could be steadied at 200 feet. I finally caught my breath then, and thanked heaven. Had the American shown just a bit more persistence and determination, he would have had a kill. Instead, RO 101 enjoyed 3 more months of life. A check of damage revealed that our periscope was smashed. That cut our operations short. I put about and headed back for Rabaul. Lieutenant Tokugawa died before morning, leaving us the problem of disposing of his body. One seaman suggested that we place it in a torpedo tube, which is what we did, sealing the tube against odours. On arrival at Rabaul, we counted a total of 127 dents in RO 101's hull, where shells from USS Taylor had struck. She must have been using high-capacity type rather than armour-piercing ammunition, else I would not be alive today. The gunnery of that American ship was excellent. RO 101 was out of action, awaiting installation of a new periscope that had to come from Truk for the rest of July. During my period of enforced idleness, Japan lost 3 more submarines. Back home, in the inland sea, Lieutenant Dr. Hiroshi Yuasa was conducting shakedown training in I-179. His ship suffered an accident and sank on July 14th. I-179 remained on the bottom until 1956, when it was salvaged. Examination of it at that time revealed an open hatch near the bow. A careless crewman had neglected to close it, and the bow filled with water, sinking the ship. I-168 was next. Yahachi's old boat, killer of USS Yorktown at Midway, left Truk for a patrol on July 25th. She was sunk in a submarine versus submarine battle on July 27th by USS Scamp. Apparently, both submarines fired torpedoes at each other, but I-168's missed. Americans erroneously listed this sinking as that of I-24, which actually had already been lost far to the north in the Aleutians 8 weeks earlier. The third submarine lost was RO 103. Under Lieutenant Rikinosuke Ichihara, it left Rabaul on patrol duty July 11th. She was last heard from on July 28th, when Ichihara reported sighted enemy ships on 3 occasions between July 15th and July 24th, but had no chance to attack. I do not think that this boat was lost operationally, but rather by either enemy aircraft or PT boats, which sometimes attacked a submarine contact but didn't get credit for a kill because they couldn't provide physical evidence that the submarine was sunk. Enemy patrols were so heavy in the Solomons at that time that it seems to me very likely that one of them made a hit on RO-103, or perhaps the submarine struck a mine, after which Ichihara's boat crawled away to die. Lieutenant Kazumichi Tanabe was flown out of Japan to take the place of my slain Lieutenant Tokugawa. We also received 3 fresh and bright young seamen from the Rabaul base to replace those injured by USS Taylor's gunfire. Our new periscope was installed, and we were combat-ready by August 3rd. I then conducted 3 days of drills and refresher training and found morale very high. The men of RO-101 had been through the shattering experience of being both shelled and depth-charged, and survived. They were full of fighting spirit and eager for revenge. We put to sea again on August 7th, this time headed for waters south of Vella La Vella Island. Chapter 12. The Solomons and New Guinea. The Battle of Vella Gulf was fought the night of August 6th. 4 Japanese destroyers, carrying 900 army troops for reinforcement of Kolombangara, were intercepted by 6 American destroyers. We lost 3 ships and 1,500 men. About 300 men made it to shore from the sunken ships. The Americans' campaign had gone well for them, in spite of losses in the year between their landing on Guadalcanal and my setting out from Rabaul on August 7th, on my 8th Solomons mission. Although the going had been slow and the fighting hard, the Americans progressed without a setback upwards along the stinking, disease-ridden chain of islands. They had covered half of the distance from Henderson Field to Simpson Harbour. And on New Guinea, in the long campaign written of as the toughest fighting in the world, our troops had been driven back from within sight of Port Moresby, their chief objective on the island's south side, and had to retreat northward over the Owen Stanley Mountains under ghastly conditions. Now they were being pushed westward along New Guinea's northern shore. RO-101 was on station by August 10th, but as a sentry we were for the most part ineffective. We were often attacked by planes at night, when I had to surface to recharge batteries. Apparently the enemy was spotting us on airborne radar, then shutting down his engines to dip in and make a silent glide-bombing attack. We rarely heard these aircraft until almost too late, and once the bombers came, PT boats usually showed up within the next 30 minutes. After a while, knowing that the enemy was always avidly seeking us during the late hours of darkness, I got an idea that served RO-101 well. Enemy patrols, I had observed, were lightest during the morning and evening twilight periods, and those times gave my lookouts some light by which to see any bombers approach. Instead of the standard tactic, submerged daytime cruising followed by nighttime surface operations, I cruised submerged all day long and surfaced during evening twilight, while the sun's glow was still in the sky but visibility was poor. Once my batteries got a full charge, down I would go again and remain underwater all night, surfacing just before the sun rose. Then we'd recharge and go down again. My tactic was successful, but it limited RO-101's ability to patrol any significant size area because of our low underwater speed, and the pesky PT boats seemed always to be about. We had to stay down to avoid detection. PT boats made my submarine totally worthless on that patrol. By August 15th, 1943, I had moved north to Gizo Strait, south of Vella Gulf. We knew that US interceptor forces were watching in that area for Japanese attempts at reinforcing our garrisons in various parts of the Solomons, and I hoped to pick off a few enemy ships. About 1 a.m. on the morning of August 18th, I saw some gun flashes through my periscope. To the north, surface ships were exchanging gunfire. I thought that our ships must be clashing with American ones and ordered my crew to battle stations, submerged. "Load all tubes," I called out, and made ready to join in the battle as soon as I could determine friend from enemy. 1 hour later, while I was still making an underwater approach to the scene of the battle, my sound operator picked up an echo on his equipment. "Possible destroyer," he called out, "running at high speed." "Stand by all tubes," I ordered. "Target is a destroyer. Set torpedo running depth at 2 meters. All lights in the conning tower had long since been dimmed so I could avoid night blindness. I swung the periscope about until it was on the bearing the sound operator had given me. There was a faint moon and the horizon was clear, but I could make out no ship. "Turret approaching," was the next word I received. "Degree of intensity is 4. 5 was the lowest reading our sound equipment registered, and 1 was its highest. The first report had been 5. After this second report, I began to make out a dark image on the horizon. Then I discerned another. 2 ships were heading in our direction, both coming directly at RO 101. Their head-on approach made the silhouettes very slim, and I could not identify them by type. I tried to judge their speed from the bow wave each was making and called out, "Target speed is 26 knots. There are 2 ships in sight." The targets then began veering off, a bit to my right, but still making good speed. I was sure our presence was not suspected, because no ship could use its sonar while moving that fast. Their own propellers drowned out everything. Now I could make out their flat, flush decks. They were American destroyers. The nearest one was not more than 500 yards away from me and crossing rapidly. I realized that I had no chance at all to hit him with a torpedo and swung my periscope over to the second ship. Then I began calling out ranges and bearings. "Bearing mark!" I cried out, and Lieutenant Kondo answered, "Set." I was ready to give the order to fire when the great wake of the first ship rolled toward me, obscuring my view. I cursed mightily, but could not let the chance pass without an attempt to strike at the enemy. In seconds, that second ship would escape. "Fire!" I ordered, even though I could not see my target, and 4 torpedoes leaped, one after another, from their tubes. The angle between the destroyer's bow and the line of sight between my boat and him was 40 degrees, right? Range was 600 yards. My torpedoes would have to make a run of less than a half mile. A submarine could not possibly have a better setup for a torpedo attack, but my torpedoes were wasted. All 4 missed the enemy ship, astern. He must have been making at least 30 knots, instead of the 26 knots I had estimated. I was ashamed of making such an error in judgment. Nothing humiliated a submarine commander before his crew more than wasting torpedoes in such a manner. The only high moments in the lives of men who lived for weeks in Japan's iron whales were when they heard their torpedoes crashing into an enemy's hull. We heard one explosion a long time afterward, but not from the direction in which I had fired. I ordered the periscope up again and looked north through Gizo Strait. A ship was aflyer there. Was it one of ours or one of theirs? From post-war readings, I have determined that the burning ship was the Japanese destroyer Isakaze. She had been hit by American ships in Vela Gulf. The ships that my torpedoes missed were 2 victorious American destroyers, which were withdrawing after the battle. They were seeking out the small craft that had been escorted by 4 of our destroyers under Rear Adam, Matsuharu Ijuin. As a lieutenant commander, he was my swimming instructor and also was my instructor in torpedoes during my years at Etajima. He pushed us very hard in both things, since he was also the supervisor for the annual 10-mile swimming race. Had I hit one of those destroyers, I might have saved some of the men Ijuin had been prevented from saving, because those American ships, after driving off Ijuin's force, ran rampant among our landing barges loaded with reinforcements. Many men died. I was called back to Rabaul on August 24th and arrived there on August 26th. A cabled set of orders was waiting for me. I was to depart RO 101 and take command of I-177. I felt sad at leaving the crew that I had trained from before RO 101's completion, but that is the way it is in a war. As a man gets more experience, he moves into positions calling for greater skills, greater responsibilities, and greater challenges. While I had been out on this patrol, Japan lost 4 more submarines. The war in the Pacific was truly developing into a hellish one for our 6th Fleet. Submarines in the Indian Ocean had things a lot easier than we did in the Pacific. I-10 and I-27 both reported sinkings in August. We at Rabaul envied them because they were doing what we felt all our submarines should be doing, attacking enemy supply lines. We were accomplishing very little in our theatre of war and were paying too heavy a price to spot and stop the Americans as they advanced. I-17, which had shelled the American west coast in February 1942, left Truk on July 25th to make air reconnaissances of Espiritu Sancto in the New Hebrides and of Noumea, New Caledonia. She had a new captain, Sir Dr. Hakwe Harada. As commanding officer of I-165 in Malay water at the war's start, Harada had been the first to sight HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, thus launching the great search that saw our aircraft send these 2 battleships to the bottom. On the morning of August 19, 1943, Harada was about 40 miles off Noumea, preparing to launch I-77's plane when an American land-based aircraft sighted his submarine in this helpless state. It attacked at once, and a number of men were caught on deck. The New Zealand corvette HMS Zoe came up and joined in the attack. I-17 was sunk. Next to be lost was I-182, commanded by my Etajima classmate, Lieutenant Cadet Mirioru Yonohara. The young tribe master left Truk for the New Hebrides area and was not heard from after August 28th. His was truly a tragedy in the great Japanese tradition. American sources state that I-182 was sunk by USS Trout in the Philippines on Sept 10. This claim is ridiculous. Yonohara's boat was nowhere near that area. He and his crew were off the New Hebrides, which are not very far, as Pacific Ocean distances go, from the Fijis. I-182 was lost in the same part of the Pacific where the native princess lost her heart to its captain years before. I think that the American destroyer Wadsworth, although it did not receive official credit for a sinking, sent I-182 down about the 1st of September. I have also read that Americans claim to have sunk I-178 on August 25, 1943. They did not. That submarine had already been lost 3 months before. The boat that they sank that day off the New Hebrides was RO-35, Later Sidior, Masateru Manabe. She went to that area from Truk and, on August 25, radioed that she had a convoy of 6 transports in sight. She was not heard from again. The American destroyer Patterson picked up RO-35 that night on its radar. Patterson moved in, and RO-35 dived. But sonar, tenacity, and depth charges enabled Patterson to sink RO-35 before midnight. The last time anyone heard from I-25 and Lieutenant Masaru Kobiga was on August 24th, when he reported that his aircraft's reconnaissance of Espiritu Sancto was successful. Kobiga, who had left Truk late in July, sent a report on the ships that were present in the enemy anchorage and was never heard from again. I think that his boat, like I-182, was attacked and sunk by an enemy ship, or perhaps even an enemy plane, which never received credit for a kill because it could not provide evidence of a sinking. Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita, who had made so many flights from I-25, including his firebombings of America, was not lost. After his attacks on Oregon, he made only 1 more flight over enemy territory, at Noumea. Then he was transferred from submarine duty to a flight instructor post at Kasumikaura, not far from Tokyo, where he spent the rest of the war training pilots for our Naval Air Force. These 4 submarines were the price we paid for sinking only 2 enemy ships, which went down in the New Hebrides. I-17 reported downing 1 before she was lost. I-19 claimed another upon her safe return to Truk. I-19 had hit the American lumber carrier, SS Absaroka, with torpedoes on Christmas Eve, 1941, off San Pedro. 18 years later, a Mr. Robert Bell claimed to have found the hull of a submarine on the ocean floor nearby, and Fort MacArthur records showed that a Japanese submarine identified as I-19 had been sunk there in 1941. This is, of course, not true. All of the 9 submarines went to the US West Coast early in the war, returned safely. I-11 had some luck in southern waters. She sank 3 ships in one day off Australia. These were SS Coast Farmer, SSG S. Livanos, and SS William Dawes. She got them on July 21st. On August 30th, while returning from patrol, she sank SS Star of Oregon. I spent a few days turning over command of RO-101 to my successor, Lieutenant Masataka Fujisawa. We went out and made a few dives, too, so that he could become familiar with the little oddities each individual ship has, which give it the personal character that crewmen come to know and have affection for. On September 4, 1943, I left RO-101 somewhat heavy of heart. This feeling had to disappear almost at once, for in a few minutes I was on board and in command of I-177, moored only 300 yards away. I relieved Sir Dr. Hajime Nakagawa. For the previous 4 weeks he had been making supply runs from Rabaul to New Guinea. The attempt to reinforce and keep the Guadalcanal and New Guinea garrisons supplied was made in 4 different ways. First, of course, were the large-scale attempts made with transports that were escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and sometimes battleships and aircraft carriers. We lost too many of the large-type ships in the first fierce fighting around Guadalcanal to continue this method. The Imperial Army then brought its own sea forces into play. The Army would assemble a convoy of 10-20 small cargo carriers and landing craft, each carrying 10-20 tons of food and ammunition, at Shortland Island, off the southeast tip of Bougainville. From this staging point, about halfway down the slot from Rabaul to Henderson Field, they would steam for the combat area. Their pilots knew nothing of the area's geography, and the smallest craft mounted but a single machine gun each. Moving only by night, they hid in coves and inlets during the day. Their average pace was a sluggish 6 knots. It took these vessels more than a week to cover the 300 miles to Guadalcanal, and American PT boat squadrons often attacked them en route. Dozens were sunk, but surviving craft pressed toward their destination with vigour and determination. Because they swarmed down in groups like ants, this means of supplying Guadalcanal was called the ARI, ant system. But no matter how hard these ants worked, what they got through to the hard-pressed garrison on the Death Island was like a cup of water poured on the desert, not enough to sustain life. So, Admiral Yamamoto made the difficult decision to employ destroyers for supply runs. A group of destroyers would form up at Shortland, usually loaded with troops and hundreds of drums of supplies lashed to the decks. Many of these drums contained gasoline, and one enemy hit could make a funeral pyre of a ship. The destroyers would race out in the morning and make their way at 30 knots to the western end of Guadalcanal, covering the final miles during darkness. Because the destroyers could carry large payloads of troops and supplies, the method was moderately successful. They did not fear the PT boat attacks because they could fight back hard when attacked. The Americans found this to be true at Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, the night when Rear Adm. Raizo Tanaka mauled 3 American cruisers and sank a 4th, although his ships were outnumbered, outgunned, and had their decks crowded with drums of supplies. The Americans nicknamed this the Tokyo Express. We Japanese called it the Nezumi, rat system. With their radar, the American destroyers were like cats in the dark, ready to pounce, and the rats had to elude them. Our best weapons were speed and elusiveness, which is what rodents use to escape death. American aircraft, however, with their radar, could detect the rats at a great distance, then swoop in like eagles to attack them. On dark nights they had additional help in their bombing runs, being guided to their targets by the phosphorescent wake every ship makes in the Solomon's waters. So, whenever lookouts heard the roar of aircraft engines, a ship's captain would slow his vessel radically to leave very little wake, then change course sharply so the glowing path left behind would not serve as an arrow pointer for the bombardiers. If aircraft, in spite of this, still found our ships, at a given signal all searchlights, which had been aimed at the attacking plane, were turned on simultaneously. This sudden glare would blind the enemy pilot. Anti-aircraft and machine guns then were often able to shoot him down or drive him off. The Americans countered by using the glide bombing tactic, which I had to endure many times myself. Upon locating one of us, the enemy planes would shut off their engines and drop silently down. Having no radar, our destroyers found it especially difficult to cope with this attack, so they were rarely used for transport operations after November 30, 1942. That is when the Mogura Mole system was put into operation. At about the same time, for the same reasons, shortage of surface ships plus intensified enemy air operations, the Mogura method was used in supplying New Guinea too. Most of our operating submarines were used for this work, leaving very few for offensive operations against our enemies. Usually, 1 or 2, at the most 3, submarines were sent to waters east of Australia at a time. They could do very little to stop the massive flow of supplies that was coming out of the United States to equip forces gathering on the southern continent. It was easier for the Americans to supply Australia all the way from the United States than it was for us to supply our southern holdings from Japan, which was a much shorter distance away. And enemy submarines inflicted upon Japan much more damage than our submarines inflicted upon the enemy. Nevertheless, I-10 sank SS Samuel Gompers off the east coast of Australia on Jan 29, 1943, and I-21 got SS Star King on Phoebit 9 in that same area. But throughout the first half of 1943, our sinkings of enemy ships were very few. On April 27, SS Lydia Child went down off Brisbane before the torpedoes of I-178. I-19 sank 2 ships on a cruise into the southern seas, SS Phoebe A. Hurst near the Fijis on April 20, and SS William Vanderbilt east of New Caledonia on May 16th. I-174 got 2 ships on the same day, south of Guadalcanal, sinking SS Chief Ouray and SS Robert Lincoln on June 22. The day before I assumed command of I-177, we lost still another submarine in the New Hebrides area, I-20, under Lieutenant CDR Hitoshi Otsuka. On August 30th, a report came in from Otsuka that he had sighted a force containing 1 battleship and 1 aircraft carrier. No more was ever heard from him. On September 3rd, the American destroyer Alet, notified that a submarine had been spotted in her area, picked up I-20 on radar. She closed in and blinked, AA, the call signal for challenge. When she received no answer, she illuminated the seascape with her searchlights and saw a submarine diving. Depth charges soon killed I-20, which was our 37th submarine lost in the war. Upon taking command of I-177, I joined the New Guinea supply effort. At the outset, I was in fine health. I had a stocky body frame, which I kept fit through exercise and healthy through good food. After my tour of duty in RO 101, during which I ate well, slept well, and was usually fairly relaxed, I was hale and hearty. Whenever in port at Rabaul, I had played tennis to keep fit and gone fishing to relax. Also, whenever possible, I had a 1-hour nap in the afternoon, drank a little beer now and then, and took advantage of being on shore to take soothing hot showers often. That peak condition, I believe, sustained me during my tour of duty as commanding officer of I-177. I was able to carry on longer than most. I made a total of 14 transport runs to New Guinea from Rabaul in I-177, the second highest number made by any I-boat captain. I set out on the first one on September 10th. RO 101 also left Simpson Harbour that day. She was ordered into the Southeast Solomons, but not one word was heard from her after her departure. After the war, I learned that my former boat had been sunk almost as soon as she got on station. Lechida Fujisawa met up with a small convoy on September 15th and launched an attack. His torpedoes missed, and one of the convoy escorts, USS Saufley, tracked him down. The destroyer attacked with depth charges, finally hitting close enough to make RO 101, blasted up war by explosions, broke. Souffle, joined by a Catalina patrol bomber, opened up with gunfire while the aircraft dropped depth charges. RO 101 was sunk quickly. Before departing Rabaul, I was briefed on the New Guinea situation by Sea Dr. Miyoshi Horinuchi, Chief of Staff to Rear Admiral Harada. On the 4th of the month, he said, the enemy landed troops at a point north of our garrison at Leh. Our garrison of about 7,000 men is now surrounded. Horinuchi told me that Lieutenant Hatazo Adachi, commander of the 18th Army Corps, was in charge of all Japanese troops on New Guinea. His chief subordinate was Lieutenant Hidemitsu Nakano, who had the 51st Division. His chief navy subordinate was Rear Admiral Kunizo Mori, commander of the 7th Base Corps, an organization like the Seabees of America. Men of our base corps would set up a base and operate it, also helping to defend it if it were attacked. Japanese sailors also were formed into amphibious attack units too, like the American Marines, getting training in machine guns, artillery, and tank warfare for this purpose. Such men defended Tarawa and other island bases. Because of their current poor tactical situation, said Horinuchi, the Leh garrison is going to execute a withdrawal. Beginning on the 11th, they will start moving out. All troops should be away from there by the 16th. They will cross the mountains and regroup at Gali, on New Guinea's north shore. The mountain range is over 14,000 feet high, where they will cross it, and they will require 3 weeks to make the trip. To sustain them during this manoeuvre, they will need the food we are going to put on board I-177. It's up to you, Orita, to get through. My Etajima classmate, Mochitsura Hashimoto, had been through submarine commander's school with me in 1942. After graduation, he was assigned to the old boat RO-31 for 8 months. He was the man who carried out the experiments that developed the containers used by our submarines in supplying Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Hashimoto was aghast at seeing the first contrivance he was asked to test. It was a sort of fragile torpedo. A rubber bag was filled with rice, he said, and was then put into a long wooden cylinder that had a hard veneer all over it. The idea was to fire these containers like torpedoes at Guadalcanal so that men could retrieve them from the beach while the submarine lay offshore, still submerged. But when we used a normal charge of high-pressure air to fire them, they burst, with rice going everywhere. The idea just wouldn't work, which surprised no one because it was so ridiculous. Another idea did work. Balloons and rubber bags were partially filled with various supplies, then inflated with air while lying on RO-31's main deck. Then they were lashed into place. A submarine could release these and dive out from under them, leaving them to float on the surface, so small craft from shore could recover them. This useful idea, coupled with one of using partially filled steel drums, was used by us in the south. Our plan was to avoid full moon periods whenever possible and arrive at our destination after dark. There, barges and lighters from shore would take off the supplies we carried, although in an emergency we could simply roll the steel drums over the side. They, like the rubber bags, would float. It took 2 days to load I-177 properly. We loaded 40-50 tons of supplies inside the submarine and 20-30 tons on deck in rubber bags and drums. Sometimes we worked under fire. The Americans were making daily raids on Rabaul after October 20th, 1943. A humorous thing about these air attacks, Mr. Harrington told me, is that during the war, writers always described us Japanese as being very predictable. Oddly, we found the Americans very predictable in attacking Rabaul. The raids usually were made between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So we would start our loading early in the morning, knock off work in time for the air raid, then submerge to the bottom of the harbour to have our lunch. We would come up after 2 p.m., when the air raid was over, and continue to load. At 120 feet, the only effect I-177 felt was a gentle rocking when a bomb exploded in the water. During the time I was operating out of Rabaul, I can remember only one submarine being damaged in an air raid. It happened in the late morning of October 12, 1943. I had just completed a transport run to New Guinea and was making my report to rear. ADM Harada on board his flagship, UN Jingei, an ancient cruiser. About 50 Japanese warships, including submarines, were at anchor when a large group of B-17s and B-24s came over. They seemed to be directing their chief effort at our submarines, because no bombs fell near Jingei or the destroyers that were present. I watched the bombing with Admiral Harada and some of his staff and became very worried about my boat. All submarines out in the harbour quickly dived, but bombs were falling so close to them that we could not really tell whether they were diving or sinking. 7 boats were present: I-36, I-38, I-176, I-177, I-180, RO-105, and RO-108. All but I-180 were moored in deep water. She was alongside a pier, undergoing repairs. From where we were, it looked like I-180 took a direct hit. We soon received no damage reports from the other boats. I was relieved to hear this, but the word from I-180 after the attack was over was sad. "Bomb hit just forward of the bridge," it read. "Superstructure destroyed. Executive Officer Lotte Toshio Higuchi killed. 3 seamen of Bridge Watch seriously wounded." Soon after the raid, the other 6 boats surfaced. I hastened to my ship.